For 10 years, a masked phantom terrorized the women of Blackwood County. They called him the Night Creeper, a predator who seemed to walk through walls, leaving a trail of shattered lives and a community paralyzed by fear. In the forgotten hollows of Appalachia, nestled deep within West Virginia, lies the small, unincorporated community of Blackwood Creek. To an outsider, it might seem like any other rural town struggling to hold on. A single road winds through it, flanked by modest homes and trailers. But a closer look reveals something unsettling. Nearly every property is encircled by a fence. Not the quaint white picket kind, but imposing barriers of wood, chain link, and sometimes even cinder blocks, reaching heights of 10, 12, even 15 feet. These aren't fences to keep stray dogs out. They are walls built to keep something sinister at bay. At night, the town falls into an unnerving silence. Porch lights are extinguished. Doors are triple bolted. The women of Blackwood Creek, especially those whose husbands work long shifts in the mines or on out-of-state construction jobs, do not venture out after dusk. For a decade, this was not tradition. It was a desperate defense against a living nightmare. A legend whispered in hushed, fearful tones. A story of a masked predator with an almost supernatural ability to scale walls and breach defenses. A phantom who preyed on women in the sanctity of their own homes. Over 10 years, he had violated more than 20 women, his attacks marked by a brutal efficiency that left the community in a state of quiet terror. This is the story of the walls of Blackwood Creek and the courageous family who finally dared to tear them down by speaking the truth. The case file on the Blackwood Creek Phantom begins with a single, terrified phone call on the evening of June 3, 2010. The call came not from a victim, but from the victim's father-in-law, a man whose voice trembled with a mixture of rage and grief. Sarah Miller had just finished dinner at her in-laws' house, a comforting weekly ritual. Her husband, Mark, was on a 2-week rotation at a drilling site in Pennsylvania, and Sarah made it a point to check in on his parents, Dale and Mary. She was more than a daughter-in-law to them. She was their daughter. After a hearty meal and warm conversation, Sarah began the short walk back to her own small house just down the lane. The air was thick with the scent of honeysuckle and the chirping of crickets, a typical West Virginia summer night. She unlocked her front door, stepped inside, and pushed it closed. The metallic click of the deadbolt had barely sounded when a presence filled the space behind her. It wasn't a sound, but a sudden, chilling drop in temperature, the feeling of displaced air. Before she could turn, a large, calloused hand clamped over her mouth while a powerful arm wrapped around her neck, squeezing the air from her lungs. Sarah was no fragile flower. Years of farm chores and helping manage their small plot of land had given her a quiet strength. She fought back with everything she had, kicking and clawing, trying to land a blow, to scream, to do anything to break free. She managed to twist her body just enough to see her attacker's face, but there was nothing to see. Only a crude mask, a piece of dark fabric with 2 uneven holes cut out for eyes. It looked slick, almost greasy, and her desperate attempts to rip it away failed as her fingers found no purchase. The pressure on her neck intensified, a crushing weight that forced black spots to bloom in her vision. The world dissolved into a silent, swirling vortex, and then nothingness. Sometime later, consciousness returned in painful, disorienting waves. She was on the cold, damp ground of her own backyard, naked and exposed under the pale moonlight. A profound, searing pain radiated through her body. Her clothes were torn and scattered nearby. The horrifying realization crashed down on her. She had been violated. A wave of nausea and shame washed over her. so powerful it almost sent her back into unconsciousness. But a primal survival instinct took over. Shaking, crying, she forced her trembling limbs to obey, pulling on her tattered clothes. She didn't go back into her house. It was no longer a home. It was a crime scene. She stumbled through the darkness to her neighbor's house, pounding on the door with what little strength she had left. When the neighbor opened the door, he was met with a devastating sight. Sarah Miller, her face a grotesque mask of bruises, her eyes so swollen they were nearly shut, her clothes in disarray. She was covered in dirt and filth, a testament to her body's involuntary reaction to the trauma. They quickly brought her inside, wrapped her in a blanket, and called her in-laws. Dale and Mary Miller arrived in a state of panicked dread. The sight that greeted them would be burned into their memories forever. Sarah was lying on their neighbor's couch, sobbing uncontrollably. The whites of her eyes were gone, replaced by a terrifying deep red from the burst blood vessels caused by the strangulation. The imprint of a hand was a dark purple bruise on her neck. Later, doctors would confirm that the trauma to her optic nerves had caused temporary blindness. Mary, her heart breaking, reached for Sarah's hand and found it as cold as ice. They were a family steeped in the traditions of the mountains, proud, private, and resilient. But this was an evil the tradition had no answer for. As Dale, his face a grim mask of fury, reached for the phone to call the sheriff's department, Sarah cried out, begging him to stop. "No, please," she sobbed, her voice a raw whisper. "Don't." "Think of Mark. The whole town. They'll laugh at him. They'll say he couldn't protect his own wife." This was the poison that had kept the phantom safe for a decade. Shame. The fear of being judged, of being blamed, of having your family's name dragged through the mud in a small town where reputation is everything. But Dale Miller, a man in his 70s with a spine forged from Appalachian steel, would not have it. "Are you crazy, girl?" he said, his voice rough with emotion. "That monster nearly killed you. You think I'm going to let him just walk away, free to do this to someone else?" Mary knelt by the couch, stroking Sarah's hair. "This is not your fault, Sarah. Not one bit of it. We are your family. We will see this through. We will get justice." Bolstered by their love and unwavering support, Sarah finally relented. Dale Miller made the call that would finally bring the long, dark reign of the Night Creeper to an end. Sheriff Frank Davis and his deputies arrived at the scene to find a situation far more disturbing than a typical assault case. The raw violence of the attack was shocking, but it was Sarah's testimony that painted a truly chilling picture. She recounted the fight, the masked attacker's overwhelming strength, and the slick, oily texture of the mask that defied her grip. She told them she never heard his voice, not a word, not a grunt, just silent, brutal efficiency. As crime scene technicians processed Sarah's home, the investigators began to piece together the phantom's movements. They found distinct footprints on the high partition wall separating Sarah's property from her neighbor's. The neighbor confirmed the wall had been cleaned just the day before. The attacker had used the neighbor's property as a staging ground, climbing the wall and lying in wait in Sarah's backyard, hidden by the darkness. He knew the layout. He knew her husband was away. This suggested a terrifying level of planning and local knowledge. This wasn't a random act of violence. It was a predator hunting on his own territory. Sheriff Davis, a man who had policed these hollows for 30 years, felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He had a sinking feeling this wasn't the first time. He decided to expand the investigation, directing his deputies to begin a canvass of the community, a delicate task of knocking on doors and asking questions that no one wanted to answer. It didn't take long for the dam of silence to begin to crack. At a small house on the edge of town, deputies encountered a woman named Jessica Evans. She lived alone, her husband a long-haul trucker. When questioned, Jessica was visibly nervous, her eyes darting away, her answers clipped and evasive. The deputies, trained to read these signs, pressed gently but firmly. Finally, under the weight of their persistent, respectful questioning, she broke down. Through tears, Jessica confessed that she too had been a victim. Just 5 days before Sarah Miller's attack, the story was sickeningly familiar. A strange noise in the yard, a masked man appearing from the shadows, the suffocating grip on her neck, the violation. She showed them the fading bruises on her own neck, her eyes still bloodshot from the trauma. She had been too terrified and ashamed to tell anyone. She feared being ostracized, blamed for being alone, for somehow inviting the attack. The deputies assured her that her name would be protected, that her courage in speaking up was the first step toward catching him. Jessica's confession was just the beginning. As the investigation widened, a horrifying pattern emerged. The sheriff's department was inundated with calls, some anonymous, some from women who finally found the courage to come forward. The picture that took shape was of a reign of terror stretching back to the year 2000. More than 20 women, possibly more, had been attacked. Some had been victimized multiple times. The attacker's methods were always the same. He targeted women whose husbands were away. He used the high walls and fences as his personal highway. He wore a mask and he never spoke a word. Sheriff Davis now understood the walls. He understood the self-imposed curfew. Blackwood Creek was a community under siege, not by an outsider, but by one of their own. The residents had responded not by uniting and going to the police, but by retreating into individual fortresses of fear and silence. The whispers of a flying rapist or a night creeper weren't just ghost stories. They were the town's way of explaining the inexplicable. Each new attack prompted another family to build their wall a little higher, reinforcing the cycle of isolation and fear that allowed the predator to thrive. Davis couldn't help but feel a surge of anger and frustration. If just one of the earlier victims had felt safe enough to come forward, this decade of horror could have been prevented. The investigation now had multiple witness statements, but they were still chasing a ghost. No one had seen his face. No one had heard his voice. They had a profile, a physically strong man, intimately familiar with the town's layout and residents' schedules, but that described half the men in the county. They were missing the one thing they desperately needed: physical evidence. That's when the forensics lab called. The technicians processing Sarah Miller's torn clothing had found something: a tiny speck of biological material preserved in the fabric. From it, they had managed to extract a full DNA profile of her attacker. It was the break they had been waiting for. Sheriff Davis immediately ordered a mass DNA screening of potential suspects in the village. They started with a list of 11 men who had been flagged for various reasons: prior offenses, suspicious behavior, or simply being present in the area during the attacks. One by one, the results came back: negative, negative, negative. It was a crushing blow. Their best lead had seemingly evaporated. But then, the lab supervisor called Davis with a fascinating and crucial piece of information. While none of the 11 samples were a direct match, the DNA of one man, Wayne Carter, showed a significant number of shared markers with the attacker's profile. It wasn't a match, but it indicated a close familial relationship: a father, a son, or a brother. The focus of the investigation instantly shifted. The suspect was a male member of the Carter family, likely between the ages of 28 and 60. The problem was, the Carters were one of the oldest and largest families in the region. A quick genealogical search revealed a staggering 420 men who fit the criteria. The task of interviewing and collecting DNA from all of them would be a logistical nightmare, taking months, if not years. The phantom could be anywhere. As Sheriff Davis and his team stared at the daunting family tree spread across the office wall, a young deputy, born and raised in Blackwood Creek, spoke up. He remembered something from years ago, a minor incident that had seemed insignificant at the time. A man named Wade Carter had been briefly detained in 2005. The deputy recalled that Carter, who ran a small scrap metal business out of state, had come back to town and gotten into a heated argument with the owner of the local video store. Carter had bought a pornographic DVD that turned out to be blank, and he'd become belligerently angry, demanding his money back. It was a small thing, a public disturbance complaint, nothing more. But in the context of a serial sexual predator, it was a flashing red light. Wade Carter, 48 years old, originally from Blackwood Creek, but he had moved to Charleston back in 1992 to run his scrap business. He rarely came back, but the deputy knew he was in town now. His son was getting married. Wade Carter was brought in for questioning. He presented himself as a calm, respectable family man, baffled as to why he was being bothered by the police. He claimed that on the night of Sarah Miller's attack, June 3rd, he was at home with his wife, busy with wedding preparations. His wife, when questioned separately, confirmed his alibi. But the investigators were experienced interrogators. They noticed things. They noticed the fresh, deep scratches on the backs of Wade's hands and forearms. When they asked about the scratches, Wade's calm demeanor faltered for the first time. He reflexively pulled his sleeves down to cover his arms, muttering that he'd scratched himself up working with some scrap metal. But the investigators knew the difference between scrapes from metal and the defensive wounds inflicted by a woman fighting for her life. Wade's nervous, evasive reaction set off every alarm bell in the room. While the interrogation continued, Sheriff Davis secured a warrant to search Wade Carter's house in Blackwood Creek. In a closet, tucked away under a pile of old blankets, they found it. A dark, grease-stained tablecloth with two crude, uneven holes cut into it. When an investigator held it up, it was unmistakably a mask. The two holes aligned perfectly with the position of a person's eyes. It was the exact item Sarah Miller and the other victims had described. The investigators brought the makeshift mask back to the station and placed it on the interrogation room table in front of Wade Carter. He refused to acknowledge it, denying it was his. But he didn't need to. The case was no longer about a confession. It was about science. A sample of Wade Carter's DNA was rushed to the lab for comparison. The results were conclusive. It was a perfect match to the DNA found on Sarah Miller's clothes. The Night Creeper, the phantom who had haunted the women of Blackwood Creek for 10 long years, was Wade Carter. Faced with irrefutable scientific proof, Wade finally confessed. The whole sordid story came pouring out. It had started years ago with an addiction to pornography. The lurid scenes he watched over and over again fueled a dark fantasy life that his reality could no longer satisfy. He claimed he'd grown tired of his wife, who he saw as aging and unattractive. So he turned his predatory gaze towards the women he grew up with, the women of his own community. His first attack was clumsy and nerve-wracking. He was terrified of being caught. Immediately after, he fled back to the relative anonymity of Charleston, waiting for news of a police investigation. When nothing happened, no sirens, no deputies knocking on doors, no whispers in the town, he grew confident. He believed he had gotten away with it. The silence empowered him. It became a twisted ritual. Whenever the urges became too strong, he would return to Blackwood Creek to hunt. He became more brazen, more practiced. He knew who was alone and when. If there were no new women to target, he would return to previous victims, re-traumatizing them. He even admitted to attacking distant relatives and the wives of his own friends. In his depraved mind, the victim's silence was not a symptom of their terror, but a form of complicity. He convinced himself that they secretly enjoyed the assaults, that his return was something they welcomed. He saw his horrific crimes as nothing more than visiting home. Sarah Miller and her family changed everything. Their refusal to be silent shattered his world of delusion. Within 3 days of their report, the decade-long reign of Wade Carter was over. The news of his arrest sent shockwaves through Blackwood Creek. The man they knew as a quiet, hard-working family man, a friendly face they'd known their whole lives, was a monster. The victims, many of whom never knew the identity of their attacker, were forced to confront the horrifying reality that their violator was a neighbor, a friend's husband, even a relative. In April of 2011, Wade Carter's case went to trial. Due to the sensitive nature of the crimes and to protect the privacy of the numerous victims, the proceedings and the final sentence were sealed from the public. But given the sheer number and brutality of his crimes, it is certain that Wade Carter will spend the rest of his natural life behind bars. With his capture, a palpable sense of relief settled over Blackwood Creek. The community held a celebration, hanging banners thanking the sheriff's department. The long nightmare was finally over. But for Wade Carter's family, a new one was just beginning. His son's wedding was called off. The bride's family, horrified, refused to let their daughter marry the son of a serial rapist. The Carter name was now synonymous with shame and depravity, a heavy burden for an innocent family to bear. Looking back on this disturbing case, the central lesson is the devastating power of silence. The victim's choice to remain quiet, born of fear and a deeply ingrained sense of shame, inadvertently created the perfect hunting ground for a predator. It was the courage of one woman and the family that stood by her that finally broke the spell and brought the community's darkest secret into the light of day. This case serves as a powerful reminder that when faced with evil, silence is not a shield, it is an accelerant. Reporting crimes and trusting in the justice system is not just about protecting oneself, but about protecting the entire community. The brave actions of the Miller family brought justice to dozens of women and allowed a terrorized town to finally find peace.